A whisper from the past, a sealed tomb that held a secret darker than death itself. Tonight, we unravel a mystery of vanished bodies, ancient curses, and the haunting shadows that refuse to rest. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on one of those drab, windless October mornings when the fog curls low over the roofs like an old man's beard, and even the gas lamps appear to shiver in protest, that I found Mr. Sherlock Holmes in a peculiarly restless frame of mind. Though seated in his usual armchair by the fireplace, his violin lay untouched upon the table, and the morning papers, those instruments of his swift intellect, remained unopened and scattered across the carpet, like the wreckage of thought abandoned midstream. He had not spoken since breakfast. I observed him closely, noting the subtle contractions of his brow and the manner in which he drummed his fingers against the armrest. Slowly, methodically, as though tapping out the rhythm of some distant and disquieting riddle. Another day without a challenge, I ventured at last, hoping to draw him from his brooding silence. Holmes did not answer immediately, but his eyes, keen, pale, and unblinking, remained fixed upon the coals, as though they might suddenly reveal the face of an old adversary. "It is the curse of the thinking man, Watson," he said finally. "To have a mind sharpened to a blade's edge, and yet no whetstone upon which to test it. The city slumbers beneath its grey veil, and with it, every manner of villainy appears likewise lulled. I dare say a quiet day may be a blessing for once." He turned slightly and regarded me with the faintest curl of amusement at his lip. "Blessings are for clergymen and gamblers," he replied. "For my part, I prefer puzzles." As if summoned by fate itself, or as Holmes might insist, the simple arithmetic of cause and consequence, there came a sharp knock at the door, followed by the sound of Mrs. Hudson ushering someone into our chambers. A moment later, a young woman entered, her eyes wide with distress, and her gloved hands clenched tightly at her sides. Holmes sat upright. The storm had arrived. The lady who now stood before us bore all the outward signs of recent grief, yet it was a grief that had been twisted into something sharper, frayed nerves and lingering horror. She was not above 30, though her pallor and manner of dress lent her a mournful maturity. Her bonnet was modest, her cloak soaked at the hem from the damp streets, and though she tried to compose herself with dignity, the tremble in her voice betrayed her unrest. "My name is Edith Verne," she began softly, her gaze flitting between Holmes and myself. I hope you will forgive my intrusion. I was told you are a man who finds truths where others find only shadows." Holmes inclined his head. "You were told correctly, Miss Verne. Or is it Mrs.? "Mrs." she replied. "My husband is away on naval assignment. It is my father I come about, Colonel Gideon Verne." Holmes gave a slight nod, the name evidently unknown to him. "He passed away last week," she continued. "A sudden collapse at Vernet Hall. The local physicians signed the certificate, and the burial was arranged with haste." Her breath caught here, and she looked away as though even recounting it would offend propriety. "It is not his death that brings me, Mr. Holmes. It is what happened after." Holmes said nothing, but I saw the intensity of his gaze sharpen. He leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "Go on," he said quietly. She swallowed, then in a whisper, "This morning, the groundskeeper went to check the crypt. He is an old man and has a habit of cleaning it when no one asks. But when he looked inside," her voice faltered. "Yes?" "The casket was empty." There was a silence, thick and complete. "Empty," I repeated, uncertain I had heard correctly. She nodded slowly. "The casket was sealed, buried with witnesses present, but now nothing. No sign of forced entry, no disturbed earth. And yet, he is gone." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, whose eyes were positively alight now. A sealed coffin, he murmured, interred one day and vacant the next. Fascinating. I don't know where else to turn, she added. People will think me mad, but I swear to you, there is something unnatural about this. I can feel it. Then perhaps, said Holmes, rising at last, it is time we paid your father's resting place a visit. Watson, you'll pack your bag. And thus, the quiet day was over. Mrs. Verne remained seated by the fire, while Holmes questioned her with that polite, detached manner which rendered even the most ghastly revelations tolerable through the lens of logic. Your father, he said, was a military man. You mentioned his death was sudden. Did he suffer from ailments known to you? She shook her head. No more than the usual stiffness of an aging soldier, but he had become different of late. In what sense? She hesitated. He had grown secretive, withdrawn. He would not let the servants into his study. He had parcels delivered at odd hours, sealed crates from the continent, and sometimes from Cairo. I once glimpsed a letter, written in some ancient hand, I think, and he snatched it away. Did he speak of his time abroad? Holmes pressed. Frequently, but not fondly. He had been stationed in Mesopotamia during an expedition, archaeological, I believe, though he referred to it as a blasphemous folly. He came back altered. At this, Holmes's brows arched slightly. Did he ever make mention of death? She looked down, then nodded. Once, during a storm, I found him in the drawing room staring into the fire. He said, "If I die under curious circumstances, make certain I remain buried." At the time, I thought it the rambling of a man haunted by war. But now, did he leave a will? Yes, he bequeathed the estate to me. But it contains one strange clause. He insisted that no autopsy be performed and that his casket be locked with iron clasps of his own design. I could not suppress a shudder. Holmes was pacing now, his hands behind his back. And this crypt, how secure is it? It lies beneath the family chapel, sealed by a wrought iron gate. The only key belongs to our groundskeeper, Mr. Clay. Any history of superstition at the hall? Some say the chapel was built upon older foundations. The villagers whisper about ancient stones buried beneath. But it is nonsense, surely nonsense. Holmes stopped and fixed her with a piercing stare. Mrs. Verne, what you have described is not nonsense. It is a pattern. Unusual, yes, but not illogical. Men do not vanish without motive, and even the dead require accomplices if they are to walk again. She gasped faintly at his words, but I recognized in Holmes's tone the unmistakable thrill of the chase. We shall leave this evening, he declared. Your father may be dead, madam, but I am not yet convinced he is at rest. And with that, the game had begun. We departed that very evening by the late train to Surrey, Mrs. Verne accompanying us in solemn silence. The journey was not long, but the final miles were made in a dog-cart hired from the station, the reins taken by a groom from Verne Hall, who spoke in monosyllables and kept his eyes on the mud-slick road. I had long become accustomed to Holmes's aversion to idle conversation during travel, and so the three of us sat in a kind of mutual contemplation, broken only by the creaking of leather and the distant hoot of owls. The countryside seemed to me an extension of Mrs. Verne's sorrow, a bleak and sodden landscape where the hedgerows drooped, the trees leaned as though eavesdropping on whispered sins, and the rising mist carried with it the chill of forgotten things. Verne Hall itself rose from this gloom like a monument to better days, its ivy-cloaked walls blotched with moss, its chimneys leaning as though weary with age. Yet in that moment, it was not its decay that struck me, but the stillness of the place. Not a dog barked, nor a curtain stirred. We were received without ceremony by an elderly housekeeper who led us through dim corridors lit only by oil lamps, their flames bending under some unseen breath. Holmes followed silently, his sharp gaze flitting from wall to cornice to floorboard, though he asked no questions. Mrs. Verne showed us to our rooms and retired without further word. As I lay awake that night in a bed that groaned like a coffin with each movement, I could not shake the impression that the house itself awaited something. Not rest, not peace, but revelation. And Holmes, I knew, intended to provide it. We rose early the next morning and made our way across the overgrown courtyard to the chapel, where the crypt entrance lay beneath a heavy iron gate. The groundskeeper, Mr. Thomas Clay, awaited us there, a man of roughly 50 years, with a gaunt face and cap in hand. He gave Holmes a perfunctory nod, then wordlessly unlocked the gate with a key of considerable age. The steps into the crypt were damp and uneven, descending into a dim chamber where the air grew suddenly cold, tinged with that distinct scent of stone and time. A single lantern hung from a hook, its glow casting the chamber in long shifting shadows. "There," Clay said, pointing to the casket, "just as we found it." Holmes moved forward, his footfalls slow and deliberate. The coffin sat undisturbed on its plinth, oak with iron bindings, as Mrs. Verne had described. The clasps bore no marks of force, and the stone floor around it was seemingly undisturbed. "No signs of tampering," I muttered. "Not with crude tools, no," Holmes replied. He knelt beside the casket, running a gloved finger along the clasp and hinges. Then he stood and paced slowly around the chamber, pausing at the walls and occasionally glancing upward toward the vaulted ceiling. "It is the air," he said suddenly. "Do you detect it, Watson?" I sniffed. There was indeed an odour, faint, foreign, a pungency not native to damp stone. "Camphor," he continued, "and something oil-based. It does not belong in a crypt." He knelt again, this time near the base of the plinth. "Ah," he murmured, "see here. The dust is swept, but not uniformly. And these marks, dragged, not lifted." I peered closer. Faint trails in the dust, curved and oddly deliberate, as though someone had pulled something in a slow, arcing motion. Holmes straightened. Whatever was done here, it was not done in haste. Clay shifted behind us. "I didn't touch nothing once I saw it empty, sir. I swear it." Holmes turned to him with that calm but piercing look I had seen unnerve hardened criminals. "I believe you. The question is not who opened the casket, but who never allowed it to be filled." He stepped back into the gloom, the lantern's light catching his expression, more animated now, as though the scent of puzzle had revived him. "I think," he said softly, "we shall find that the Colonel never intended to remain among the dead." Following our examination of the crypt, Holmes expressed a desire to view Colonel Verne's private study. Mrs. Verne led us through the west wing of the house, a portion clearly less used than the rest. The air within tinged with the faint bitterness of extinguished fires and unopened drawers. "It has not been touched," she said, unlocking the door with a brass key from her chatelaine. "I did not wish to disturb anything, not until I understood what had happened." Holmes gave a nod of approval and stepped inside. The room was modest for a man of Verne's rank, its shelves crowded with military histories, weathered volumes on ancient civilizations, and curious objects I could not identify. But it was the desk which drew Holmes's attention. He bent over it with immediate interest, drawing out each drawer in turn, examining the grain of the wood, the dust along the edges. At last, he paused at a shallow drawer tucked at the rear, which bore the faintest sign of having been tampered with. "Recently forced," he murmured. Clumsily. He drew from within a single torn page. The rest of the contents, it appeared, had been removed. Holmes read aloud, "The vessel must remain closed, not for superstition, but for reason. We have awakened what was meant to sleep beneath the black sands. I alone bear it now. The others, Carstairs most of all, must not speak. He looked up. Curious phrasing. Note that it is not mystical in tone but measured. A man trying to remain rational in the face of irrational consequence. I frowned. Carstairs? You recall the name? Indeed, Holmes replied. Mrs. Verne mentioned him. Her father's old war companion. We shall speak to him next. I glanced again at the page. And the journals? Removed deliberately, likely by someone who feared their contents, or had reason to suppress them. He tapped the sheet once, then folded it into his pocket. We are not merely dealing with the disappearance of a body, Watson. We are tracing the path of a secret men have buried deeper than the Colonel himself. The sun was retreating behind the pines when Mrs. Verne arranged for us to meet the three men most closely associated with her father in the final days of his life. We assembled in the drawing room, a heavy, dark chamber dominated by portraits of stern-eyed ancestors, and it was there we encountered Major Lionel Carstairs, Reverend Hargreaves, and Thomas Clay once more, now summoned formally. Holmes took the lead, his manner courteous but distant. He seated himself near the hearth, allowing the firelight to cast strange shadows upon his face as he surveyed the trio in turn. Major Carstairs, he began, I understand you were present at Colonel Vernet's death. The Major was a broad-shouldered man of 60, his features bronzed from sun long lost. He sat with the stiffness of an officer still on duty. I was, he replied. Gideon collapsed without warning in the library. The doctor said it was his heart. The man was under considerable strain. Did he speak before the end? Carstairs' gaze wavered for the briefest moment. It was sudden. Holmes gave no reaction but turned to Hargreaves. You performed the burial rites, Reverend? The clergyman, a nervous figure with parchment skin and thin hands that clutched his knees, nodded. Yes, sir. The Colonel was disturbed in his final weeks. He spoke to me of penance and judgment. I tried to comfort him as best I could. Did he mention anything specific? A fear? Hargreaves' voice dropped. He said there were things buried in the desert that should never be touched, that some discoveries unearth more than bones. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He spoke of Mesopotamia. Hargreaves nodded faintly. Yes. But he begged me never to repeat it. Holmes turned then to Thomas Clay, who had taken a place near the wall. The groundskeeper avoided our eyes. Mr. Clay, Holmes said, how long have you been in the Colonel's employ? 26 years, he muttered. You hold the only key to the crypt? Yes, sir. Holmes paused. And yet you say you found the casket empty. I did, sir. That's the truth. Holmes regarded him steadily, then rose. Gentlemen, thank you. You have been most helpful. As the men withdrew, I turned to Holmes. Well? Each man holds a fragment of the truth, he said. But they are not telling it. Carstairs is concealing something more personal. Hargreaves is frightened but not lying. And Clay. He is a man caught in a web he does not understand. He moved to the window and gazed out into the encroaching dark. This is no longer a case of missing remains, Watson. It is a question of what those remains once carried. Secrets, curses, or something worse. And with that, the fire in Holmes's eyes burned brighter. The following morning found Holmes in a curiously meditative state. He had risen early, but rather than pacing or dictating telegrams as was his wont, he stood for long minutes at the window of our guest room, hands clasped behind his back, observing the mist that still clung to the moorland beyond. It was only after breakfast that he summoned Mrs. Verne to join us in the library, ostensibly to revisit the final hours of her father's life. I must ask you, madam, he said, to recount again the circumstances surrounding the Colonel's death. Omit no detail, however slight. She nodded, her voice low but steady. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because the post had just arrived, and Father had received a letter. Red wax, unfamiliar hand. I found him in his study not 10 minutes later, the letter crumpled in his hand and his nose bleeding. He was crying out. Not words, just a terrible sound. And then? Holmes asked softly. He collapsed. I sent for the physician at once. He declared it a stroke, though I have never quite believed it. The letter was gone when I returned to the room. Holmes made a brief note and then summoned Major Carstairs to join us once more. The man entered with the same rigid military bearing, though I observed a twitch in his jaw as he took his seat. Holmes offered no preamble. Describe for me, if you would, the Colonel's final moments. Carstairs hesitated only a beat. He was in the drawing room when it happened. We were discussing an old campaign, Alcout, I believe. He stood to fetch a book, then staggered and dropped to the carpet. There was no warning. No nosebleed. No letter. None that I saw. Holmes did not correct him, merely offered his usual thin smile. You must have been quite shaken. Carstairs gave a stiff nod. We had served together for decades. I knew him as a man of iron. To fall like that. When the Major had gone, Holmes turned to me. Well, Watson? The accounts are irreconcilable, I replied. One speaks of a seizure after receiving a troubling letter, the other of a sudden collapse while reminiscing over war stories. Precisely, Holmes said. One speaks with grief, the other with rehearsal. He rose and moved toward the fireplace. There is truth here, Watson, but it is in pieces, and pieces must be fitted, even when they resist the hand that would place them. Later that day, Holmes requested a second conversation with Reverend Hargreaves, who agreed with visible reluctance. We met in the small vestry adjoining the chapel, a cold chamber lined with hymnals and the faded scent of incense. I will not trouble you long, Reverend, Holmes said with disarming politeness. Only a few questions regarding the Colonel's final days. Hargreaves clasped his hands together. If I may be honest, Mr. Holmes, I have prayed for this to pass quietly. There is something unwholesome about the affair. Holmes inclined his head. That sentiment appears to be widely shared. Did the Colonel seek your counsel near the end? The Reverend's eyes shifted. He did, several times, and always with dread upon him. He spoke of sins, grave ones, and asked whether it was possible to atone without confession. What was the nature of these sins? I asked him that myself. He said only this: it was buried once, and never should have been found again. Holmes folded his arms. Did he mention Mesopotamia? Hargreaves stiffened. Yes. He believed something had followed him back. Not a person, you understand, but a presence. He quoted scripture, but only the darkest parts. Job, Lamentations, even the Book of the Dead. Curious material for a soldier. Or a thief, the Reverend said bitterly. He feared not death, but judgment. I think he believed it had already begun. Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. One last thing. Did he ever use the phrase, a vessel not meant to be opened? At this, Hargreaves' pallor deepened. Yes. He said he had touched something that was sealed long before our kind knew how to pray, that it would bring ruin, not on him alone, but on any who tried to claim it. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, with the faintest sigh, he extended a hand. You have been most helpful. Outside, as we walked slowly back toward the hall, Holmes murmured to me, Guilt, Watson, is the ghost most often mistaken for a curse, but this one may be both. That afternoon, Holmes expressed a desire to return once more to the crypt. Mrs. Verne, though visibly uneasy, gave her assent, and Mr. Clay was summoned with the key. The groundskeeper had grown more silent since our first visit, and though he offered no protest, there was a furtive tension in the way he handled the lock. an unwillingness perhaps to disturb the dead a second time. Holmes descended first, and I followed close behind. The chill below was more biting than before, or perhaps I merely imagined it. Holmes moved methodically about the chamber, retracing his earlier steps, but this time with greater intensity. He paused near the base of the plinth, knelt, and produced a slender blade from his coat. With a deft movement, he began to dig into the hardened clay just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. "Watson," he said quietly, "hand me that case." I passed it down, and a few moments later, he held something small and flat between his fingers. "A shard," he murmured, "not of stone, but of fired clay. Here, observe." He handed it to me. The piece was no larger than a man's thumb and bore a curious imprint, a series of concentric shapes surrounding a central mark that resembled an eye or flame. The edge had broken cleanly, as though it were once part of a larger disc. "I've seen such symbols before," I said, frowning. "Though where, I cannot say." "Mesopotamian," Holmes confirmed. "A seal, or part of one, likely Sumerian in origin. This was not placed here recently. It was buried with some care, perhaps years ago, but it is no accident." He gestured toward the colonel's now vacant coffin. "Do you recall the signet ring Verne wore in the portrait above the mantel? It bore this same symbol. Stylized, yes, but unmistakable. You believe he brought this back from his campaign?" "I do, and I believe he feared it." I turned the shard over in my hand. "But why bury it here?" "To protect it or to hide it? Perhaps both." Holmes stood. He knew it would not be found in the study, but if he believed his final resting place to be sacrosanct, then here he might conceal that which he could not destroy. And now that resting place is empty. Holmes's expression hardened. "Which means either the secret has been uncovered, or it was never meant to stay buried at all." The locals, as is often the case in country matters, were not without their own narrative. That evening, as Holmes and I ventured into the village to speak with the innkeeper under the pretext of hiring a second carriage, we were drawn into hushed conversations over mugs of ale and creaking floors. "They say he walks," one man whispered, his rheumy eyes darting about the room. "Who walks?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "The colonel," he said. "Gideon Verne. Not 2 nights past, my boy saw lantern light flickering round the crypt gate. Swore he heard chains." Another voice chimed in. "Saw him myself. Back turned, coat all wrong for these times." Then he was gone. Holmes remained silent, content to let the words flow. "They say he were buried twice," the first man continued. "Once by the living, and once by those he wronged. He was never at rest." I looked to Holmes as we stepped back into the damp night. "Surely you don't credit these tales?" "No," he replied, "but superstition often grows around truth, like moss upon stone." "Then what truth lies beneath this particular moss?" He paused, gazing across the churchyard, now little more than vague silhouettes in the rising mist. "A man seen walking in the fog may be nothing more than another man. A lantern, a trick of the eye, but the whisper of chains, that is oddly specific." "You think there is a basis?" "I think someone wants to be seen as a ghost, Watson, and when a man desires to haunt the living, it is rarely for reasons spiritual." It was later that same evening, as we sat once more before the fire, that Mrs. Verne approached us. Her face bore the pallor of one struggling with indecision, but there was resolve in her voice. "There is something I have not told you," she said. "Something I did not know whether to believe until now." Holmes inclined his head. "Please, madam, omission is often the enemy of discovery." "My father," she said, "once commissioned a tunnel beneath the chapel." Holmes did not react. "A tunnel? Yes, decades ago, during renovations. He claimed it was to reinforce the foundations, but I overheard him telling the mason to create a hidden passage that led beneath the crypt. He said it must be wide enough for a man to pass, and it must be sealed from within. "Did you ever see it?" I asked. She shook her head. "Only once when I was a girl. He opened a hatch behind the altar and told me never to speak of it. Years later, he said it had collapsed during a storm and was of no use." Holmes folded his hands. "And now? I think he lied. I think he always kept it. Perhaps for escape." Holmes rose and began to pace. A hidden passage, a self-designed casket, a sealed crypt, and a vanishing corpse. The Colonel planned something, and not recently. He foresaw his death, or something like it, and laid the groundwork for resurrection or disappearance. "You think he may still be alive?" I asked. "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that he planned to be. Whether he succeeded is another question." It was on the following morning that Holmes's actions took a most curious turn. After an hour spent alone in the Colonel's study, during which time I heard the distinct snapping of sealing wax and the rustle of old parchment, he emerged with a gleam in his eye I knew all too well, the glint of calculated mischief. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "We must have a word with the vicar, and then with Mr. Clay." We proceeded at once to Reverend Hargreaves, whom Holmes addressed with a curious blend of solemnity and urgency. "Reverend," he said, "you must indulge me in a theatrical flourish. I wish you to announce to the village, subtly of course, that we are to exhume the remains of one of the Colonel's ancestors. I shall give no further explanation, save that it may relate to an irregularity in the burial records." Hargrove blinked. "But, Mr. Holmes, the Colonel's family—" "Will remain uninformed," Holmes said, "and you, sir, will make mention, loudly and in the presence of others, that a specialist from the British Museum is expected tomorrow. Use those exact words." The Reverend, more confused than convinced, nonetheless agreed. Holmes then turned to me. "Now to the chapel." We descended into the crypt once more, Holmes carrying a slim parcel wrapped in oilskin. From this, he produced a circular clay object, uncannily similar to the broken seal we had found days before, though now perfectly intact. The symbol of the eye, the flame, the concentric lines, all were etched with remarkable precision. "You forged it?" I asked in astonishment. "I recreated it," Holmes corrected, "with enough fidelity to unsettle the guilty." He placed the object behind the altar, just visible in the corner of the lantern light. "Why not the crypt?" I asked. "Too obvious. A relic moved from where it should not be found will cause greater panic than one left to rest. This, Watson, is bait. Not for a thief, but for a conscience." We returned to the hall without further word, and Holmes made no mention of our ruse to anyone else, not even Mrs. Verne. But I knew then, by the stillness of his manner and the taut focus in his gaze, that the moment he had long awaited was finally near. The hunter had set his snare, and now, like all true predators, he waited. It was nearly midnight when Holmes roused me. He had taken no supper and spoken little since our earlier errand, but the alertness in his manner was unmistakable. He moved with quiet certainty, and I followed him wordlessly across the sodden lawn toward the chapel, our steps swallowed by the fog that hung low and silver about the stones. We carried no lantern, lest our presence be betrayed, and Holmes had earlier arranged the faint glow of a candle to remain flickering just inside the chapel's eastern window, a false beacon to suggest the room was unwatched. We took our place behind the stone rail of the choir screen, where the shadows were thickest, and waited. Time passed slowly, marked only by the creak of the ancient timber above and the soft ticking of Holmes's pocket chronometer. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether the man beside me had learned the art of stillness from some foreign master. for he remained so utterly motionless that even the air seemed to part more quietly around him. Then, just after the hour, I heard it, the faintest scrape of stone. Not from above, but below. Holmes's hand touched my arm lightly and I held my breath. From behind the altar, where the plinth bore Verne's empty coffin, a section of flagstone shifted. Slowly, deliberately. A figure emerged. He was stooped, wrapped in dark cloth, and carried no light. But as he reached toward the spot where Holmes had placed the false seal, he paused. His head turned, sensing what, I cannot say. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion. "I should remain quite still, Mr. Clay," he said evenly. The man froze and then bolted. Holmes was on him in 3 strides. I rushed forward, but by the time I reached them, the struggle was over. Holmes held the man's collar firmly in his grasp, and Mr. Thomas Clay, the loyal, trembling groundskeeper, stood pale and sweating beneath the flickering candlelight. "You were not expecting a witness," Holmes said. I only meant to move it," Clay stammered. "I didn't take nothing, I didn't." "But you removed the Colonel's body, didn't you?" Holmes asked quietly. "Before the burial." Clay's silence was answer enough. "Who paid you, Mr. Clay?" Holmes asked. "I don't know," he muttered. "I never saw his face. Just the note. The money. Said to wait till after dark. Said it had to be done before the morning." Holmes turned to me. "This," he said, "is no longer the act of a grieving daughter's paranoia. It is a conspiracy of silence, and its center lies deeper than any grave." Clay's hands trembled as Holmes released his collar. The man leaned against the cold stone of the crypt wall, his breath shallow, his eyes darting between us as if seeking some escape that would never come. "You must understand," he rasped. "I didn't know the Colonel was alive, or dead. I only did what I was told." Holmes folded his arms. "You were instructed to remove the body from the coffin before burial." Clay nodded. 2 days before the funeral, a letter came. No name, only directions and 5 sovereigns. It said the body would be ready that night and that I was to use the old passage under the chapel. "Was the passage open when you arrived?" "It was, unsealed. The Colonel was already in the chamber, on a stretcher, wrapped in linen. Another note said to place him in the tunnel, near the stone door, and close it behind me." "Did you see anyone else?" "No, sir, only the body and the instructions." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And the casket. I took it out the next day, brought it into the crypt while the hall slept. It was empty. No one checked. No one would dare disturb a Vernet's rest." "And you thought that was the end of it?" Clay hesitated, until he died again. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "I found him 2 nights later," Clay whispered, "in the woods behind the hall, cold, eyes open, no wound, just dead." "You buried him?" Clay nodded. "Where he asked to be buried. There's a place near the brook. He'd told me once, years ago, if he were ever hunted, he'd want to sleep there." "And the seal?" Clay's face twisted. "It was in his hand." Holmes turned to me. "The Colonel did rise, Watson, but only far enough to realize that he could not run from what waited for him." And with that quiet pronouncement, Holmes turned and walked toward the chapel steps. "There is one piece left," he said. "The one who arranged it all. The one who knew where to press a dying man's fear." It was not until the following morning that Holmes requested an audience with Major Carstairs. The man entered the drawing room with the same ramrod posture, yet I noted a hollowness to his expression, as if some unseen burden weighed more heavily than before. Holmes wasted no time. "Major," he said, "you lied to us. About the Colonel's final moments, about your knowledge of the crypt, and most importantly, about Mesopotamia." Carstairs said nothing. You were part of an archaeological expedition, Holmes continued, one that discovered something ancient, and by your standards, valuable. Yet it was not declared to your superiors, nor reported to the museum. Instead, it was divided among those who found it. Still Carstairs remained silent. Holmes stepped forward. Colonel Verne brought home a relic, one he feared, one that haunted him. You, on the other hand, brought nothing, because you never left it behind. You carried your portion in silence, but when the colonel threatened to speak, you acted. Carstairs' voice, when it came, was low and strained. He was going mad. He believed the thing cursed, said it had taken the others, Ellison, Markham, Pritchard, all dead within 5 years. He blamed it, said it followed him. Holmes's tone remained even. Did you believe him? The Major's composure faltered. Number the Y believed he wanted to believe it, because the alternative was worse. What alternative? Carstairs sat. That it was all for nothing. That we unearthed something sacred, desecrated it for the sake of empire and gain, and damned ourselves in the process. He couldn't live with it. He couldn't even die with it, so he begged me to help him vanish. You staged the death. Yes. I procured the drug, mimicked a seizure. We buried the empty coffin, moved him through the tunnel. But he wasn't meant to leave the grounds, only to rest in secret until the museum claimed the artifact. That was the plan. But he did leave. Carstairs looked up, eyes sunken. He panicked, said it wasn't done, that the seal wasn't enough. He fled. And died in the woods. Carstairs nodded. He wrote to me, said he couldn't carry it any longer. Holmes crossed to the window and stared out over the misty lawn. Guilt, Major, is not so easily buried, nor is fear. You built this deception upon the bones of old sins and asked a dying man to bear the weight. Carstairs closed his eyes. It was meant to be quiet, he whispered. Holmes turned. It never is. After the confrontations had subsided and the major players dispersed, Holmes and I returned once more to Baker Street. The evening was heavy with the scent of rain, and the fire in our sitting room struggled against the creeping chill. Holmes was silent for some time, staring into the flickering flames, the lines of thought visibly etching themselves deeper upon his brow. I have considered every detail, he began at last, and find that this case is as much about the human heart as it is about any object or act. Colonel Verne was a man undone not by forces external, but by his own torment. He leaned forward. The staged death was no mere ruse for escape. It was an act of desperation, a man clinging to illusion in the face of inevitable judgment. I nodded, urging him silently to continue. The Colonel's obsession with resurrection was not born of mysticism alone. It was rooted in the fear that his past, his sins, his deeds abroad, would follow him beyond the grave. To cheat death by deception seemed a balm for his guilty conscience. Holmes's eyes glimmered. But man is not so easily fooled. The body may be hidden, the coffin emptied, but the mind, no less than the soul, cannot flee what it knows. He recounted how Verne had arranged for the hidden tunnel, the secretive removal of his body, and the false casket, all in an attempt to control the narrative of his own death. And yet, Holmes said, in trying to escape the world, he only hastened his undoing. For fear is a powerful master, but a poor protector. I was struck by the tragedy of it all, a man so terrified that he would refuse the final rest and instead dance on the edge of shadow and silence, only to succumb at last to his own dread. Holmes's voice softened. The anatomy of this delusion is one we must remember, Watson, when we judge men who take flight from death, not by the body, but by the conscience. Holmes's thoughts then turned to Major Carstairs, whose guilt weighed heavy beneath his stoic exterior. This man, Holmes said, was a product of his time and station, a soldier bound by loyalty but shackled by shame. He spoke at length of the expedition to Mesopotamia, the imperial quest that had brought Verne and Casket into contact with relics not meant for European hands. The relic, the seal, the vessel not meant to be opened, these are symbols of a sacred trust violated. Holmes's tone grew stern. Casket knew the price of this betrayal. The lives lost, the curses whispered. He was a man desperate to contain a scandal that would have shattered his world. Holmes recounted Casket's orchestration of the deception, the drugged seizure, the empty casket, the staged disappearance. In burying the past, Casket unwittingly ensured its resurrection in blood and fear. His attempts to hide the truth only spread its shadow further. He looked to me gravely. Empire is built on such sins, Watson. And like all sins, they demand their reckoning, no matter how far we run or how deep we bury. Holmes concluded with a quiet resolve. In this case, the ghosts are not merely those of the dead, but those of the living, men bound by honour, guilt, and the cruel cost of ambition. Holmes's thoughts turned next to the missing artifact, the Mesopotamian seal that had sparked this chain of tragic events. I found him seated at his desk, poring over letters and accounts from the expedition, piecing together a puzzle that stretched far beyond Verne Hall. "It is likely, Watson," he said, "that the relic did not vanish into the ether, but found a new resting place, within the hallowed halls of the British Museum, though under a guise." He outlined how artifacts of dubious provenance often entered such institutions, masked by false documentation, catalogued under innocuous names, and thus shielded from scrutiny. "This," he continued, "is the quiet crime of forgetting. To steal is one thing, but to consign history to oblivion is far worse." Holmes spoke of the dual nature of such objects, revered as treasures by some, cursed relics by others. "Some things," he said, "do not belong to glass cases but to sealed tombs. When removed without respect or understanding, they carry not just history, but vengeance." He mused on the peculiar power of collective denial that allows such transgressions to flourish under the guise of scholarship. It is a subtle poison, Watson, a betrayal of trust, not just to the past, but to ourselves. As the night deepened, I found myself reflecting on the emotional undercurrents that had driven this case. Here was a man, Colonel Verne, consumed by fear and haunted by guilt, seeking solace in elaborate illusions of escape. Holmes, ever the analyst, approached the case with clinical precision, yet even he could not deny the tragedy beneath the surface. "The line between superstition and guilt," I remarked, "is a narrow one." Holmes nodded. "When a man fears his own past more than death itself, superstition becomes a refuge, but it is a cold refuge, and often a prison." We spoke quietly of how the living sometimes endure far greater torment than the dead, shackled by memories and regrets. "Their ghosts," Holmes said, "are often more tangible than any spirit." I could not help but feel sympathy for those caught in the web of their own making, Carstairs Clay and above all the Colonel himself. "It is not merely a puzzle of bones and relics," Holmes mused, "but of conscience and consequence." In the final moments of our investigation, Holmes produced the fragment of the cuneiform seal he had recovered. He held it delicately between his fingers, turning it in the firelight. "Some puzzles," he said softly, "are best left incomplete." I looked up sharply, but he continued. "Not because they lack solution, Watson, but because some truths are burdened with more than facts. They carry memory, sin, and the weight of those who wish to forget." He placed the fragment carefully into his pocket. "We have unravelled much, but the shadows linger. The past is never truly dead. It merely waits to be found again. I regarded him thoughtfully, sensing the quiet melancholy beneath his sharp mind. The game is over, Holmes. For now, Watson. But as ever, there will be another. And with that, he reclined, the restless hunter at peace, if only for a moment. As we settled once more into the quiet of Baker Street, Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled, his gaze distant yet piercing. Watson, he began, this case reminds us that no man can truly escape the past he carries. The Colonel sought to cheat death not through medicine or mysticism, but through secrecy and illusion. Yet it is not the resurrection that haunts us, but the memories we refuse to bury. What do you think was the greatest mistake that led to this tangled tragedy? Was it the desire to hide the truth, or the fear that bred such desperate acts? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe for more tales of intrigue, and don't forget to share this story with fellow lovers of Sherlock Holmes. The game, as always, is afoot.